It's interesting how sometimes there's like a really thin line between a true visionary and someone who's just really good at conning people.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of what we try to do here. It's like, how do we actually figure out how to separate the people who are genuinely trying to change the world from the ones who are maybe more interested in, well, lining their own pockets.
Yeah.
And the world of televangelism is just fascinating for this kind of stuff. I mean, you got faith and finance all mixed up together. So that's why we're taking a deep dive into more Cerullo today, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, his career is a wild ride of huge global outreach, but then there are all these serious accusations too, so it's kind of the perfect case study.
For sure. So was he a true spiritual leader, or was there something else going on? Like, what was he really after?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. How do we actually know about this guy? So Cerullo claimed he had this dramatic conversion to Christianity. He said he ran away from a Jewish orphanage at 14, and then, bam, a few years later, he's launching his own ministry. And a lot of it was focused on faith healing, which, by the way, is the whole idea that prayer and religious rituals can actually cure illnesses. It's been a big debate for centuries. Some people see it as a miracle. Others think it's taking advantage of people. It's complicated.
Yeah, and the story of Cerullo's early life, it almost sounds like one of those classic hero stories, you know. You've got the orphan boy who finds his calling, overcomes all this adversity, and then takes his message to the whole world. It's a narrative that just grabs people, especially people who are looking for hope and meaning.
Oh, totally. And he built a massive following from that. I'm talking stadium-sized crusades, millions of people across continents. Plus, he wrote like over 80 books, had his own daily TV program called Victory Today. Even back in the 50s and 60s, he was a master of using media to get his message out there.
Oh, he was way ahead of his time in that way. I mean, long before the internet, he understood how powerful broadcasting was. Taking his message beyond just the people in front of him and straight into people's homes, that was huge for his rise in the Pentecostal movement. But things get really interesting in 1990. That's when he bought up all the assets of another televangelist, Jim Bakker, and his PTL ministry.
Okay, now this is where I feel like the grifter or gifted question really gets going. Because PTL had just completely imploded in this giant scandal. Financial mismanagement, sexual misconduct allegations. It was a mess. So Cerullo comes in and buys up all their stuff, including the Inspiration Network, INSP. It definitely made people wonder what his angle was.
Yeah, it was a bold move. And it makes you think, was he really trying to save a ministry that had fallen apart? Or was he just a businessman seeing an opportunity to make some money?
Right. And then he makes all these changes to INSP. He starts moving away from purely religious programming. Suddenly you've got Western shows like Gunsmoke and Bonanza airing alongside sermons.
Yeah, and viewership just exploded. Advertising revenue went way up. It became a commercial network, which was pretty unusual for a religious broadcaster back then. And under his son, David, who eventually took over INSP, even started paying corporate taxes on those profits. Now, that might sound like they were trying to be more transparent, but critics were saying the problem wasn't about paying taxes. It was about the fact that they weren't being transparent about their finances overall. There were allegations that a lot of money was going straight to the Cerullo family. And that just made everything seem blurry, like where did the ministry end and their personal enrichment begin?
So is this just a clever way to disguise a for-profit business as a religious network?
That's the question, isn't it? And the financial controversies didn't stop with INSP. Cerullo had all these accusations about his fundraising tactics throughout his whole career.
Oh, really? Like what kind of accusation?
Well, there were claims that he was promising people satellite dishes if they donated, but then they never got them. And some former employees even filed lawsuits. They said he was using these really high-pressure tactics and playing on people's emotions to get them to donate. And a lot of times he was targeting people who were already struggling. There were stories about people going into debt, even mortgaging their homes just to give money to his ministry.
Wow. That brings up some serious ethical questions about how far is too far when it comes to fundraising for religious organizations.
Yeah, it definitely goes beyond just asking for support. It's about the methods and whether or not they're taking advantage of people.
Exactly. And then you add in all the controversy with his son David and how he ran INSP.
Yeah,
It gets even harder to figure out what was really going on.
for sure.
So was Cerullo truly a visionary who got caught up in some shady dealings? Or was he just a master manipulator who used religion to get rich?
It's tough to say. Human motivation is complicated. It's possible he started out with good intentions, but then things changed. Money, power, and influence can be really tempting, especially when you're in the spotlight like he was.
It makes you wonder about what happens when ambition goes unchecked, even in religion, which is supposed to be about something bigger than ourselves. But how do we figure this out as outsiders looking in? How do we separate the genuine from the fake, the visionary from the con artist?
It's a challenge, there's no doubt about that. But I think there are a few things we can keep in mind to help us see things more clearly.
Okay, I'm listening.
First, I think we have to look at actions more than words. Anyone can say the right things, but it's their behavior that really shows us who they are. Look for consistency between what they're preaching and how they actually live their lives. Do their actions match their values, or is there something off?
So don't just listen to what they're saying in their sermons or writing in their books. We have to look at their track record, how they treat people, how they handle their finances. Basically, all the stuff that might show us if they're hiding something.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second thing. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions and demand transparency. If someone claims to be a spiritual leader, if they say they're being guided by some higher power, then their actions should be open for everyone to see. They should be willing to explain their finances, respond to criticism, and have open conversations.
That's hard though, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you're already a follower, if you've already bought into their message. It's easy to just ignore anything negative and say that people just don't understand.
Oh, absolutely. That's why this next part is so important. You have to look for different perspectives. Don't just rely on one source of information, especially if it's coming from the person or organization you're trying to evaluate. Read what critics are saying, listen to people who disagree, and consider all sides before you decide what you think.
So basically, do your homework. Be informed, and don't just take things at face value, even when it comes to faith.
Exactly. It might seem counterintuitive to some people.
Yeah.
But in today's world where there's so much information, but also so much manipulation, I think it's crucial to be just as careful with spiritual content as we are with anything else we buy or consume.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so we've talked about the potential for people to be manipulated, the importance of transparency, and why getting different perspectives is so important. But what about Cerullo himself? Where does he fit into all of this? Have we figured out if he was a grifter or gifted?
Honestly, I don't think we can say for sure. But maybe that's okay. I don't think the goal is to label him one way or another. I think it's about using his story to look at our own beliefs, our own vulnerabilities, and how good we are at separating truth from lies.
So what do we do with all this information? How do we apply what we've learned about Cerullo to other people we might come across who are charismatic and controversial?
Well, that's what we're going to talk about in our next segment. We're going to take everything we've learned about Cerullo and use it to create a kind of grifter detection kit that you can use to navigate the world of leadership influence and the tricky line between real inspiration and calculated manipulation.
So we've talked about some of the big things in Cerullo's career, and it's already pretty confusing, but let's focus on a couple specific things that really bring up those grifter or gifted questions, like that movie he was promoting in the early 2000s.
Yeah, that one's a good example of how faith and entertainment can get mixed up in a way that feels manipulative.
Right.
He was advertising in Jewish newspapers, promoting a film about an Israeli rabbi, and he made it sound like it was all about cultural understanding and different faiths coming together. But then it turns out the whole thing was basically a tactic to try and convert people.
Wow.
A lot of people felt tricked, like he'd taken advantage of their trust.
That's messed up.
Yeah.
So was that like a planned move to target a specific group? Or did he just totally misjudge how people would react?
It's hard to know for sure, but then you've got all these accusations about his fundraising being unethical, which seem to come up over and over again throughout his career.
Yeah, those are tough to ignore.
Right.
What were people saying exactly?
Well, some former employees said he'd use really aggressive tactics and emotional appeals to get people to donate, and they said he often went after people who were already in a vulnerable position.
That's awful.
Yeah, there were stories about people going into debt or even mortgaging their homes just to give money to his ministry.
That's so sad. It's definitely crossing a line. It's not just about asking for help anymore.
Right, it's about whether the methods are exploiting people.
And then you add in all the controversy with his son David and how he was running INSP.
Yeah.
It's like every layer we peel back just makes the whole thing more and more questionable.
David Cerullo's salary as the CEO of what was supposed to be a nonprofit religious network was a big issue. Critics said his lifestyle, the private jets, the fancy houses, it just didn't match the message of humility and service that the network was preaching.
Yeah, that's a tough look.
It made people think that maybe INSP was more about making money than helping people spiritually.
So do you think Cerullo was a visionary who truly believed in his mission, but then kind of got lost along the way and started doing some shady things? Or was he always a con man, just really good at disguising his greed as religious devotion?
Yeah, It's really hard to say. It's possible he started with good intentions, but somewhere along the lines, things got blurry. Power, money, influence, they can be really hard to resist, especially when you're as famous as he was.
It makes you think about how dangerous unchecked ambition can be, even in something like religion, which should be about something bigger than ourselves. So how do we figure this out? How do we tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys, the visionaries and the con artists?
It's a tough question for sure, but I think there are a few things that can help us see things more clearly.
Okay, I'm all ears.
First of all, I think we have to look at actions instead of just words. Anyone can say the right things, but it's what they do that really shows us who they are. You have to look for consistency between what they preach and how they actually live their lives. Do their actions line up with their values, or is there a mismatch?
So don't just listen to their sermons or read their books. We have to look at their track record, how they treat people, how they handle their money, all the stuff that might show us if they're hiding something.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second thing. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions and demand transparency. If someone says they're a spiritual leader, if they say they're guided by some higher power, their actions should be open for everyone to see. They should be willing to explain where their money comes from and where it goes, respond to criticism, and have open conversations.
That's hard though, right? Especially if you're already a follower, you've already bought into their message. It's easy to just ignore anything negative and say that people just don't understand.
Absolutely. That's why this next part is so important. Look for different perspectives. Don't just rely on one source of information, especially if it's coming from the person or organization you're trying to evaluate. Read what the critics are saying, listen to people who disagree, and consider all sides before you decide what you think.
So do your homework. Be informed and think critically,
Yeah.
even when it comes to faith.
Exactly. It might seem strange to some people,
Yeah.
but in today's world, there's so much information, but also so much manipulation. I think it's important to be just as careful with spiritual content as we are with anything else we buy or use.
That's a great point. So we've talked about the potential for manipulation, the importance of transparency, and why we need to get different perspectives. But what about Cerullo? Where does he fit into all of this? Did we figure out if he was a grifter or gifted?
I don't think we can say for sure, but maybe that's okay. I don't think the point is to put a label on him. It's about using his story to think about our own beliefs, our own vulnerabilities, and how good we are at separating truth from lies.
So what do we do with all this information? How do we use what we've learned about Cerullo to help us understand other people we might meet who are charismatic and controversial?
That's what we're going to talk about in our last segment. We're going to take everything we've learned about Cerullo and use it to build a kind of grifter detection kit that you can use to navigate the world of leadership influence and the tricky line between true inspiration and calculated manipulation.
All right, so we've spent all this time digging into Morris Cerullo's life and career, and honestly, I'm walking away with more questions than answers.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those cases where it's not so clear-cut.
But maybe that's the point. Maybe sometimes there isn't a perfect answer. But we did talk about making a kind of grifter detection kit to help us see those red flags when someone's got charisma, but their actions are a little sus.
Right, exactly.
Where do we even start with that?
Well, I think the most important thing is critical thinking. We can't just blindly believe everything we hear or let our emotions take over. We've got to use our brains.
So don't just accept things at face value. Don't get swept up by a charming personality or a sob story.
Right. Ask questions. What's the real reason behind this message? What are they assuming? Does it all make sense logically?
And that's especially important when we're talking about things like religion or self-help, where people's feelings are already really involved.
Oh, absolutely. Strong emotions can cloud our judgment and make us way more vulnerable to being manipulated. So that's where healthy skepticism comes in. Don't be afraid to doubt, to question authority figures, to ask for proof. If someone's making these big claims, they better have the evidence to back them up.
Like with Cerullo and his faith healing claims, some people might find those stories really inspiring. But a healthy skeptic would want to see some real proof, not just stories from people.
You got it. And that brings us to another important point, fact-checking and looking at where your information is coming from. Nowadays, it's easier than ever to check if someone's telling the truth and look into their background. Don't just take their word for it. Do your own research.
So check their credentials. See if other people are saying the same things. Read articles from reliable sources. Basically, be a detective.
Exactly. And the next tool in our kit goes along with that, follow the money. Especially with organizations or people who ask for donations, it's super important that they're transparent about their finances. Where is the money coming from? Where is it going? Are there any conflicts of interest?
That's where things got really shady with Cerullo and INSP. The fact that they weren't open about their money and that his son was apparently living so extravagantly, those are major red flags.
Definitely. And finally, and this one's probably the hardest to learn to do, trust your gut. If something feels wrong, if you have a bad feeling about something, don't ignore it. Your intuition is often picking up on little things that your conscious mind misses.
That's interesting. So we're not just talking about logic and evidence here. We're also talking about trusting that inner voice that tells us when something's off.
Exactly. It's about using all of these tools together. Critical thinking, healthy skepticism, fact-checking, financial scrutiny, and intuition. When we put all those things together, we get a way better view of the world, one that helps us tell the difference between the people who are truly good and the ones who might just be out for themselves.
So I think the big takeaway from our deep dive into Morris Cerullo's life and work is that in a world where a lot of people are charismatic, but also controversial, it's up to each of us to think critically, to be careful about what information we believe, and to trust our gut. At the end of the day, it's our responsibility to figure out what's true and what's not.
Well said. And remember, questioning things doesn't mean you have less faith. It actually makes it stronger. When we ask questions and think critically, we're using our intelligence and our independence, and that makes us better followers, more informed citizens, and ultimately more powerful individuals.
That's some great advice. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the world of televangelism and Morris Cerullo's complicated legacy. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning things, and don't be afraid to think for yourself.